Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new track review video where I get to talk about several recently released songs I happen to hear and have some opinions on. Pretty much just going to be going through these tracks, sharing my thoughts on them, just my own personal opinion, so if you happen to disagree or anything, that's perfectly fine. So with that said, let's get into the first track I want to talk about here today. This first track I'm going to be talking about is actually the comeback track from Rammstein with their new song, and I'm going to butcher this for sure. Deutschland, probably saying that wrong because I am terrible with other languages. In fact, if you watch this channel enough, you'll probably notice I'm terrible with English too, even though that's my primary language that I've spoken since birth. I still mess up words in that language all the time, so I'm certainly not going to be good with German or any other language really. So, I'm really looking forward to reviewing this new album from these guys in a couple months or so, because that's going to be a fun video for me pronouncing things. But yeah, that aside, this track here itself was one I was pretty excited to hear, considering that this is the comeback track from these guys, like I said before. I believe it's been about 9 or 10 years since the band dropped their last album, so it's been a good while now. And like many fans, I've been anticipating their return, and this new track here, being the first taste of this return, was something that I was really excited to hear. And overall, I will say this is a pretty good track at the end of the day. I do feel that in many senses, this is kind of the band doing their typical sound, really. Like, there's not too much to this track that I would say that's really out there or new or breaking new ground for the group, or this genre of music in general or anything like that. But it still is a really solid song at the end of the day, and it is one that I enjoy a fair bit. Overall, this track has a very grand and bombastic feel to it. It feels a little triumphant too at times. Though given some of the lyrics on this track, I'm not sure if that's what they were going for necessarily. More on that later. I love the vocals on this track, especially during the chorus, which is just very grand, over the top, and catchy. It's the kind of chorus I'd want to sing along to if I wasn't going to butcher the language that it was in. I love the guitar parts here on this track and how they add to the very bombastic nature of the song. I love the synth part that runs throughout this track as well. Overall, this is just a really pleasant sounding track, and it's one that I think is pretty enjoyable to listen to. And the lyrics here on this track are pretty interesting as well. They see the band trying to, face their home country, Germany, which the track is named after, and the history behind the country, and I guess the good and bad that kind of comes along with being a German person, as they kind of mention here in the lyrics, or at least based in the translation I saw of the lyrics, which, I'm not sure 100% if the translation's right, but I saw several translations, and there were certain themes that were repeated throughout multiple of these translations I saw online, and in all of them, the band seems to have this interesting relationship with their home country. I guess this kind of ambivalent relationship where they, of course, kind of like being German because, it's their home country and all that, but at the same time, their home country has been behind some not very good things in history that obviously the band doesn't like and doesn't condone. So this kind of creates this very interesting relationship that is explored here in the lyrics. Overall, it makes for a very interesting song topic, and even though I don't understand the lyrics as I'm listening to the track, they were still pretty interesting to explore and dive deeper into when it came to actually, trying to see translations of the lyrics and read into it a bit more. This track also comes with a pretty big budget, stellar music video attached to it that also explores some of these themes as well. I know I don't typically talk about music videos in this segment just because, it's track reviews, it's not music video reviews, but I do feel like mentioning the music video here is something I'd like to do, just because it's a pretty nice music video overall, and it really does expand on some of the themes and ideas talked about in the lyrics here. That I think it's definitely a good video to watch if you are interested in this track, if you like the song overall. It's definitely worth watching. It's a pretty interesting video, and yeah, I think it does a good job expanding on the topic that the song itself already had going for it. Like I said before, my biggest problem with this track is probably that at times it is just a bit typical for the band when it comes to its sound, despite the interesting lyrics and the very grand and bombastic video attached to this track. I feel like if you were to just take this thing for, what it is just based on the sound alone, which is pretty easy for me to do given that I don't speak the language and understand the lyrics as I'm listening to it, sonically, it's not all too different from some tracks and the general sound I've heard from this band in the past, which is somewhat of a bad thing, I feel. I was kind of hoping that maybe this would be a bit more adventurous and a bit more new sounding in a sense, but you know, I can't complain too much given that despite the fact that this thing is very much typical for the band, it sounds pretty good at the end of the day. So I can't really complain on that front, especially given the fact that the lyrics on this thing and the video tied to it are also pretty interesting in their own right and are, in some regards, pretty new and different for the band. So yeah, I would definitely say that this is a good track overall, and one that you should definitely check out if you're a fan of this group. If you're a fan of rock music, the video is worth checking out as well. Overall, pretty solid track, and I'm pretty excited to hear this new album from these guys later on this year. Moving on, though, the next track that we're going to be talking about is this new JPEGMAFIA track, The Who, that also features Eyas. I hope I'm saying that name correctly. And see, this is what I meant before when I was talking about the last track. I'm not good with names, just in general, so yeah. This track, though, comes as a leftover track recorded during the Veteran sessions, Veteran being JPEGMAFIA's last studio album released last year, one of my favorite albums of last year, overall a pretty great hip-hop record. And this track here, kind of coming from the sessions of that album, I was hoping to that the quality of it would be pretty similar to that album overall. And I would have to say that in some regards I could see how this came out of the sessions for that album. This track has some of these similar kind of glitchy industrial sounds that whole record as a whole tends to have. Though I will say that this track overall has a bit of a poppier, a bit more lighthearted of a sound compared to much of that record that was just very angry and very in your face. A lot of the lyrics here on this track are still very much in line with a lot of what appeared on Veteran, but it's just the sound of this track feels a bit off from Veteran as a whole, so I can understand why this track wasn't included on that record. I will say, though, that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this track. Overall, there's qualities to it that I enjoy, but overall, I'm just kind of indifferent to it. At the end of the day, I'm not a very big fan of the kind of poppier, not poppier per se, sound this track has going for it, but the more light-hearted feel, I guess you could say. I think Peggy's flow on this track overall is just okay. It didn't really blow me away or anything, but it wasn't really terrible either. It was just kind of average. The feature on this track was also just kind of okay in my opinion. It didn't really do too much to enhance my enjoyment of the track, and it just kind of felt a bit out there considering some of the more aggressive tones that were present on Veteran overall. The instrumental to this track is probably my favorite aspect of it, though still I don't think it matches up and surpasses the best of the instrumentals that appeared on Veteran. Overall, I don't dislike this track necessarily. There's lots of qualities to it that I think are interesting or that I think are pretty enjoyable overall, but at the same time, there's a lot of aspects of this track that I just think are pretty average at the end of the day and that don't really impress me all too much. Given that this was a leftover track from an album, it's not the worst thing in the world, but I would mostly recommend this track to the hardcore JPEGMAFIA fans out there, and the people who are really into Veteran and everything related to that album. If you don't really fall into that category of people, I'm not sure that this is a track I'd necessarily recommend to you. But oh yeah, overall I thought this track was just pretty average. Moving on, the final track I want to talk about here today is a new King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard track, Boogieman Sam. Now, prior to this, I hadn't really been super familiar with this group overall. I've heard good things about them in the past, but only recently have I decided to start checking out some of their back catalog and some of their best records, which I have been enjoying a fair bit. And as a result, yeah, I'm pretty interested in checking out this new album of theirs that's coming out later this year. So when they had a new track out, I decided, might as well review it. And overall, I think that this is a pretty decent track at the end of the day. It's not one that really blew me away once again or anything like that, but I think it's pretty solid overall. I like the groovy feel that this track has going for it overall. It's just a really pleasant track to put on and listen to. I like a lot of the guitar work here on this track as well. I think it's easily the most standout aspect of the track. If I had any complaints for this song, however, it is just that, it's not the most standout thing in the world. It's easily a track that I could feel would kind of get, forgotten in time for me. Unless, hearing it in the context of the album it's tied to makes it a lot more interesting or better or something like that. But overall, taking this track on its own, it's a decent song for sure. It's pretty pleasant to listen to at the end of the day. But at the same time, there's not a whole ton to it that really jumps out at me and calls me back for repeated listens or anything like that. It's just a really decent song, I guess. So overall, I would mostly recommend this track to fans of the band. I'm not really sure if people outside of that demographic would really care for this track all too much. But yeah, I was just, I thought it was a decent song, but nothing I was really crazy about. But yeah, that concludes today's track review segment. If you happen to have an opinion on any of these tracks that's different than mine, either you liked it more than I did or liked it less than I did, it's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you like that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.